Welcome to Parasordium. I'm your host AJ, and today we're speaking with Jenny Chan of the Pacific Atrocities Education Channel. The subjects we're talking about today may be triggering to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Hello, Jenny, and it's nice to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me.
What do you do for PAE?
Yeah, so PAE, Pacific Atrocities Education, I'm the director of and co-founder of our organization. And our organization, Pacific Atrocities Education, our website is pacificatrocities.org, is a nonprofit research and educational organization. And our mission is to uncover, document, and also teach the forgotten histories of Asia Pacific theater during World War II, where millions of lives were lost. Basically, if you do the low estimate, it's about 30 million, and the high estimate is like 42 million. But these lives they're like forgotten stories, and so we're bridging the gap between academic research and also public awareness to ensure that these millions of voices silenced by war and geopolitics are finally heard.
What is it exactly do you do within the organization?
Yeah, so we're kind of like historical recovery specialists at this point. Our team basically take like raw declassified or overlooked history and turn it into more accessible history. So you can see like blog posts on our website. So it basically go into like research, and we publish blog posts and also sometimes like more serious publication. And also we create lesson plans for school for next generations to have a complete map of global history. And we also have a YouTube channel where we talk more about overlooked history, and also we have a declassified digital archives from the National Archives. A lot of our material comes from the National Archives, and also like oral history testimonies about how people have survived the war. And we put it up on our Omeka website. Is a free digital online digital archive that anyone can use. In fact, last year, some high school students used it to produce a documentary um, for National History Day, and they won first place at New Mexico for the state competition. And it was crazy because they were telling me that none of the judges or whoever they were interviewing, I mean, whoever were like watching their documentary and the competition had even heard about like things like Unit 731 or like, World War II in Asia, and they didn't know that much about it. And so what we're doing, I hope, is making a difference.
Well, just in that exposure for those students in doing that documentary and having the judges not even know about what they were talking about, right there,
Right.
that proves your point that it's necessary for people to have access to this information. What hidden histories have you uncovered with your organization so far?
We uncovered a lot of the Unit 731 cover-ups from during Cold War, how America formed this relationship with Japan. And basically, Let me explain what Unit 731 was first.
Yeah.
So, for listeners who are not, who don't know what it is or it was a Japanese biological warfare program, and it basically conducted like human experimentation and also produced, um, weapons that are produced with germs. And so it's horrific. And after the war, not a lot of the scientists ever got into, I would just say that most of the scientists did not face justice.
Yeah.
Even though that they were basically, I would call them war criminals because they were doing human experimentation. And I have to stress that this is not like just one raw and rogue individual who just did that. It was funded by the state. The emperor itself himself funded this whole laboratory for biological weapons research, and also human experimentation. And I have to say that after the war, the post-war justice, because America was more focused on fighting communism, that they then turned around and bought the human experimentation results from the Japanese scientists, even though that what they were doing was horrific.
Mm.
And other hidden stories include like the comfort women of China. Not a lot of people know about China also had comfort women. I would say that like, and comfort women were like sex slaves that were basically held in wartime China. And there's a lot more of the Korean narratives of this sex slaves like in the 1990s, but I
Yeah.
would say that in like other parts of the world, comfort women was also a thing. And being educated in the West, I don't think that we have really learned much about this kind of sexual slavery that was happening in Asia. And it was established because when the Japanese were fighting and invading China, they started getting STDs. And so then, in order to make it safer for, per se, the Japanese fighting the war, they established these comfort stations. So then they have like an in-house physicians to make sure that the comfort women were like clean and sanitary for the Japanese soldiers. And when I was interviewing, I did an interview in 2015 with like comfort women in China, and it was horrific. They were telling me what they have endured during the war and how they basically nearly took that kind of experience to their graves. Because after the war, they were facing horrific, like, kind of discrimination, and they were being ostracized because it's such a taboo topic that people don't talk about,
Mhm.
especially in like a Chinese village. So yeah. And then we also have done our first, like, we have published the first book in English about the Quantum Army, which was actually responsible for starting the war like 10 years before Pearl Harbor.
Okay.
And it's like, and most people don't talk about it, that World War II in Asia, I'll argue that it started in 1931 when Japan occupied Manchuria and called it Manchukuo. And what's interesting is that, like, by 1933, they basically quit the League of Nations. And and Mussolini and Hitler saw that and were like, "Oh, you can just do that." So then they follow suit later, and then the World War II in the West started in 1939. And in order for us to think that, to ignore this whole chapter of like China being invaded since 1931, I feel like we ignored this whole part of history where like Japan even quit the League of Nations and kind of just started a whole like, movement that like they just ignore international law. um, and by sidelining and not thinking that whole part of World War happened in Asia, we kind of sideline that history and ignore that that even happened, and kind of just made it so that it doesn't. It's a lesser place in history than we think it is.
That's that was new information for me. I knew living in Canada that we joined the war in 1939, uh, but I know that some people did join um, the fight earlier than that, but it's not really talked about, and
Yeah,
so that's right there.
and it's wild to me that like also Canada sent more troops to Asia, like to Hong Kong, than like they did to Europe.
Yeah, yeah,
And that's something that we don't really talk about. Yeah. And by not talking about that, we kind of sideline this really important part of history.
yeah, yeah. It's an entire 10 years of the war that no one knows anything about. When you do these lesson plans, how do you present this information?
I think that we try to present it in a way that fit into curriculum already. So like for example, we don't go into like, oh, how horrific Unit 731 was because, we're not going in for shock factor, we're going in for facts.
Yeah,
So a very popular lesson plans that we have is about how um uh it's about ethics. It's about where do you cross the line for science and ethics. Science advancement, especially now I feel like we live in such a technocratic day
yeah,
of living. Like, how do you know when you have crossed that line of ethics? Like, for example, during World War II in Asia, a bunch of scientists looked up to Ishishiro because he got a bunch of money to start Unit 731. So then everyone in that biological scientific community wanted to do human research because they wanted to be the next Ishishiro. And so by examining that, we kind of not just talk about history, but also like kind of look into better how we just don't follow suit.
just in that the lack of knowledge of it, because a lot of times people don't want this to come out for their own political reasons.
Well, and also in a way, it's almost the opposite of that. I feel like America doesn't want to look like they were losing for 2 years of the war. If you look at it, like they kind of want to glorify how they have won. So
Yeah,
then they don't talk about their own people that were captured as POWs, right? Like as prisoners of war. And they don't want to talk about how they were struggling until like I would say like until they got the islands. And I think that's also a very interesting dynamic. And the American Japanese relationship, I have to say, have been very interesting and fascinating since like the 1800s.
yeah,
Like Matthew Perry showed up on Japanese shore, then they killed a few Japanese, some people got assassinated, and then they overthrew the whole like Tokugawa period and installed an emperor and rapidly westernized and tried to become more like the West. And like in at one point during this Meiji Restoration, they even had like propaganda where they're all the Japanese are now dressed in like Western suits and we're leaving Asia behind. And in a way, it's like so then they're signaling that they're becoming more Western. And and then by becoming more Western and rapidly Westernizing and sending all of their top diplomats to to the West to learn, right? They even sent like Conical, who then become a top diplomat, to to Harvard. And then that same guy was able to convince Teddy Roosevelt that Japanese were just the Yankees of the East, were so similar. And that's how, like, he convinced Teddy Roosevelt to take on Japanese side when negotiating for the Russo-Japanese War
Mhm.
after the fact that like that's how they kind of gained Korea and that's how they were also able to like leverage Teddy Roosevelt's relationship and fundraise at Wall Street just by acting more like the West. And they fundraised at Wall Street for this like war endeavor. But of course, it was more complicated than that because that Russia was basically at the time were expelling Jewish people out of their homeland, and a lot of Jewish bankers at the time really were like upset with the Russians, and so we're telling Japan, you take whatever money you need from us and to fight Russia.
Mhm.
And in a way, like that story itself is so similar to like the world today. And it's so interesting too because like Japan then at that time with like Russo-Japanese was then attacking Port Arthur in a surprise attack, and Teddy Roosevelt was all excited, was like, oh, it's great for Japan. But then when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, like, decades later, and it's a surprise attack, another Roosevelt is like condemning Japan for doing so. So it's really interesting, and like people's perspective change due to politics and like the time with the politics, and like in a way, US had kind of raised this little monster of like Japan, Imperial Japan, until it got attacked, until it was losing, right?
Yeah.
And then after that, after they won, and then after they occupy it, they use politics to kind of suppress what Japan had done as
Yeah.
well, because they now realize that they need to fight China, and by telling this narrative that kind of, and by suppressing that Unit 731 even happened, they kind of just created this narrative that, we almost see Japan as a victim. We never see it as like before 1944 when they were truly an aggressor in Asia.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think politics really changed a lot of things.
It did. Where where exactly do you get all of your records? Like, do you get them uh, from archives, or is it a
Yeah.
broader?
Yeah, so when we first started, I did more of like interviews and oral test and oral interviews because I knew that these survivors would not be living for too much longer. And
Yeah.
so I did, however, we had to do to like get, these kind of testimonies and oral history. And but then we moved on to more primary sources from the National Archives in the United States. Sometimes we also look at the National Archives in Japan. We work with some Japanese scholars on that, and also some like someone who was like the son of like 1644 was helping us with like trying to figure out the name of the people who were working in that unit, and but it was like super secretive. There's only like a name chart and whatnot. And yeah, so by using, and we have scanned over like 1 million pages from the National Archives. And yeah, and people can find that on our website.
In the process of doing that, how are you preserving your data? Are you housing it internally, or are you just working with these organizations to house the data as well?
So the National Archives has no money. We have a lot of money to fight wars and escalate in everywhere in the world.
Mm.
But unfortunately, the National Archive told me that they have no money to do kind of digitization. So we use we bring our own scanner to the National Archives, believe it or not, and like we just start scanning and digitizing because some of these pages are super fragile paper records, and then we need to use like metadata to also tag to make sure that these million pages are searchable. So then,
Mhm.
like younger generation can definitely use it and is searchable for like researchers, students, and families looking for their own history. Recently, we did a thing about a blog post about and a video about how this group of flyers were actually flown into Tokyo to bomb the mainland, and but then they were captured, like the B-29 bombers were captured and then they were used for human experimentation. And like the grandnephew of this like pilot actually emailed me to thank us for about like making it not forgotten.
Okay.
Like their family was missing like one third of their family because of like this instance that happened. And just imagine that there's like millions across the world who probably lost one of their family because of these like atrocities that happened in World War II in Asia.
The information that you gather is vital to not only them, to maintaining an actual record of everything. Um, have you thought of expanding beyond on just what you've done as well?
Yeah, definitely. But we would need funding for that.
That's the hard part.
Yeah, and it's hard. I think funding is the hardest part. And yeah, we're really trying to um expand what we've been doing, and also by, just expanding and get more about get people to not only think of history as like one incident, or like to look at it as in a very narrow-minded way of like, oh, this is what happened and this is why China bad and blah blah blah. Like I think we like to frame a lot of things as like communism or like China bad or like Russia bad, but like things are often in the gray area. I mean, if you look into historical record, American history is not all sunshine either.
Mhm.
By killing all the way to the west, they had manifest destiny, right?
Yeah.
And it's so biased if you look into our history books, and also like how Russia, like okay, for example, after World War II, and Russia actually had like Operation August Storm in um in Manchuria, and they captured some of the Unit 731 scientists and brought them onto a trial. But then like the Western media would call it like, oh, this was a communist propaganda trial, so this is not valid. But then later, like decades later, we realized that what they were saying
Was
was
true.
valid. The trial was valid. And but then in 1974, they had like their own anthrax spilling. Anthrax was produced in like Unit 731. And so then that the Soviet Union definitely took some of the stuff that was in Unit 731 and tried to make it themselves after the trial. And so I'm not like pro one country, and I think that we should really, stand for the truth
Yeah.
about history.
How are you building your archive actually? So you're by collecting the data, digitizing it, and adding metadata to it. How is it? What mechanism is it built on?
We are building it on Omeka, so it's like a platform, kind of like WordPress, and we can that way we can put in metadata. We use Dublin standard, so it's searchable for researchers and scholars.
Okay. When you're done with this information, are you sharing it with museums as well, or is it just the education network?
The museum is a great idea. I have talked to a few museums, but I need to reach out more.
Museums, what we see in the public is not even 1/10 of what they have behind the scenes that they can't do anything with
Yeah,
until
I
something
know.
comes out like this.
Yeah, I know. And it's so like hard too because like sometimes you just have like a million items, but it's like hard to curate. It's hard
Yeah,
for us. Like we start scanning so many pages and then I'm like, okay, it's like hard for us. Well, it's easy and hard at the same time to like come up with a topic and like a prominent topic that's related to our to what we've been scanning, for example.
yeah,
So I think it is hard to curate. I think especially with like so many things. Yeah, I think curation is really like an art.
it is. It is. It You have to package it in a way that the public can digest it, on top of doing it in a way that honors the actual core material, as well as make it entertaining enough that people will stay to consume it. And
Right.
having like having papers, having a blog, having a YouTube channel allows you to kind of cover the bases that way.
Yeah, definitely stand in strong solidarity with the indigenous calls for like truth and reconciliation. And I think that's what like scanning and also trying to see what history, like trying to tell history in a forgotten voice is about. And also, the atrocities in the Pacific, they also happened on the indigenous population, for example. For
Mhm.
example, like what is it called again when they had like a baton in the fire, the Marine, having some, I'm blanking on the name, the
Mm,
fire. Um, that was happening on Okinawa. And
okay.
then it's like the violence on them are like, tripled on on them. They were first colonized by the Japanese, and they faced the Marines, and then the Japanese told them to, oh, you need to go kill yourself. If not, then the Marines going to be more cruel. And then like you can see that like they're actually being like they belong there.
Yeah.
They're being
Yeah.
forced out of their
Their homes.
their homes
Mm,
exactly. And it's just this is really land theft if you
yeah.
think about it, and an erasure of a whole culture. And you can't really have social justice for them without historical justice, in my opinion, as
Yeah.
well. And like look at how like they also expel Hawaii's queen, what's her name? I'm blanking out on names today, but you know
It's
what
okay.
I mean. They
Yeah.
expelled the Hawaiian queen, and then they have Dole Plantation, and Dole Plantation is like because you can't have a queen, and you can't have an Asian queen, in the place like Hawaii. So when U.S. was colonizing Hawaii, they expelled the queen. They put in this Dole Plantation guy as like the boss, and
Mm,
Dole Plantation is supposed to be in charge of the infrastructure of the dam. And look at what is happening in Hawaii today. It's flooding because the
funny.
dam is failing. And if you think about it, it cost 20 million to fix the dam. Last year they had $94 million, $95 million in dividends. I think that's like the close number. It's like cost like maybe 1/5 of their dividend so-called profit.
Yeah.
So they're like mass exporting pineapple while they're not even trying to figure it out and fix the land. And I think that we need to like recognize like these indigenous sovereignty and also like specific trauma that each person really face during occupation. And I think like facing like that kind of historical truth is really a vital part of our work. And of course, like with our current political climate, sometimes we get really backlash, and they're like,
Yeah.
"Oh, this is such an idiotic comment," and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
But we have to confront history. We can't just be like, oh, this is what happened, the end. But like, we need to think about why things are happening. And like, in a lot of way, if you look at the today, like the Hawaiian flooding, it has a lot to do with their colonial history, and it has to do with a lot of how they're being exploited. And yeah, sorry, I got really passionate there.
It's okay. Passion is necessary when you're talking about this stuff. History is as much about the people as it
Yes.
is about the things that happen, the facts. You can have all the facts in the world, but if you have no connection to those facts, it doesn't compute to people that it's necessary to keep it around and keep it in our memory so that future people, future, our children and our children's children have a rudder for them to say, okay, these bad things did happen. How can we fix them so that they don't happen again? Can you tell me a bit about your podcast and what you do with that?
Yeah, so we have a podcast called Pacific Front Untold, and we basically talk about everything from like Russo-Japanese War to like World War II in Asia. We even talked about how Hawaii was colonized the other day on our podcast,
Yeah,
and we got some like hater comments, but like what we were talking about was, truthfully is in like archival history, and they weren't lying about like why they needed to colonize Hawaii in these like documents, and so it's like true. But people with certain political lens don't feel that way.
yeah.
We it's kind of a space for unfiltered historical inquiry, and also I do deep dive conversations with like James Bradley, who wrote about the Imperial Cruise, and also the China Mirage, and we don't just talk about like what happened. We also talk about why it was hidden and what's like to find the truth, and also how the stories impact the world today.
Do you have access to a lot of personal stories as well? Because you said in the beginning you did a lot of in-person
Yes, we do,
interviews.
and we don't put it on video because sometimes, people don't really want to talk on video, but we did publish them in our books, such as like Panay Guerrilla Fighters and like Undrowning Lotus, which is a um based on the interviews I did with these Chinese comfort women.
With the Chinese comfort women, when you've done the stories, how has that been received?
How has that been received? I think it's people are shocked more than anything, I think, about the brutality that these people survived in. But then like if I post about comfort women too on Instagram, I also get like so many trolls. I think it's like the word comfort woman, and then all the trolls would just come and like try to tell you that they were like high paid prostitutes, for example.
Right.
And yeah, so I think it's not there's a lot of, I hope that they're bots, but who knows? Maybe some people think that way, and it's just but it's been mostly positive. Like we have many subscribers, and it's only like I would say a percent of a percent who like would break out like that.
Where can people find your podcast, actually?
Yeah, it's mostly most up to date on YouTube. But they can also find us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And just search for Pacific Front Untold. Or just visit our website for direct links.
What are your current projects? Are you working on anything new at the moment?
Currently we're working more on like the POW projects, and trying to we're always working on something new, and you can always see what we're up to on our website, on our blog posts and whatnot.
Do you have Any particular stories that kind of affected you that
The
happened?
comfort woman, when I was interviewing them, it really did affect me. Like it took me 2 years to digest their story to write like and at the time, because it's not so, people were always like, oh, this narrative from China might be false and blah blah blah. So I had to write like historical fiction. But one of the women was telling me that after like a year and a half of being like kidnapped and captured in the comfort station, by like close to the end of the war, she was pregnant, and so then she her mom told her to keep it a secret from everyone, and so then she kept it a secret, and then she like had to she then like gave birth, and her mom and her like went somewhere to like basically bury the baby, so then they won't kind of no one would know. And she never talked about that like decades after the war. And it's just like these kind of heartbreaking stories. It's not just affecting like one generation, it affects like multiple generation. And people get like ostracized by talking about it. And like what I was talking about earlier with like the sexual trafficking and the slavery, like it's so terrible. Like why would people do it?
It comes down to power in
Well,
taking over.
and I think that it has to do with like superiority, like what you were talking about,
Yeah,
supremacy, like what you were saying, is that once you think that you're above someone else, then you can do things like that.
yeah, and that narrative has allowed so many atrocities. The history books say that the exploration of the West was to find a means to get to China,
Hmm.
to the Silk Road. But if that was the case, what was their intention? Was their intention to invade and take over China?
Well, they did have an open door policy, the so-called open door policy, where they basically exploited China. And they never talk about it. They cut China up as like a melon, and then they call it and China still call it the century of humiliation because they sold so much opium, like to China as well. Like if you think about it, Queen Victoria is the biggest dope dealer
Yeah,
in the history,
yeah, yeah.
in world history. And the craziest thing about it is that then American Industrial Revolution came, and Americans needed money to fund that, to fund the Industrial Revolution. What did they do? They also sold opium. Rockefeller sold opium. FDR's grandparents sold opium. The Delano family sold opium. And it's just this thing they got to China to exploit and also to extract. They burned down the whole summer palace, right? And then when the Chinese people had enough and they needed to have their Boxer Rebellion, then they were like, "Oh, let's like suppress that." And and I think today we have this media of narrative of China bad because China is no longer allowing that to happen to their country.
Mhm.
They're not allowing their country to be suffering, by having these Western powers to melt and cut, their country. And so then you will see often on Western headlines about how China is bad. Just because, I'm like, well, they needed to build that because they need to protect their country. When China was downtrodden, everyone took advantage.
Exactly. And now that they're basically uh, setting boundaries. As soon as you set a boundary, that's when they start saying, "Oh, you're bad.
Right,
You're
exactly.
preventing us from exploiting you. You're bad." It's like, come on. But it's the same thing that they did to Africa.
And I think it's interesting because this is going off topic here. I think Africa and a lot of like, these smaller countries can probably learn, or like they're not smaller, but they're, they're currently still still being bullied. I think they can study and learn from the China model.
Yeah,
Not too long ago, Chinese people were also being bullied. And now, they're rising up and they should study and learn how to also rise up.
yeah. Because of racialization of humanity, we've had atrocities based on that fact.
Yeah.
Um,
I agree, yeah. And we try to really simplify things, but I think it's really it's, to make it fit a certain narrative. And I think that's something that we should stop doing.
yeah, yeah. It's all connected. We need to accept that it's all connected and work within that and kind of take responsibility and a little bit of and use a little bit of discernation when we're dealing with people that want us to commit to a certain ideology. Is there anything you'd like to promote?
Yeah, for those who want to know more and like, maybe pick up a book from our website, just go on our website, pacificatrocities.org. We try to update our website homepage as much as possible so it stays relevant. And yeah,
Excellent. And they can find you on Spotify and YouTube under your
Pacific Front Untold, we cannot do atrocities because then we get shadow banned.
yep. Yeah, it's of course.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming on with me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Please like, follow, and subscribe wherever you're listening from.